Hi, Kaylee, Emma, here to explain report number 2.
Okay, so what we did for our experiment is that we based it on James' assumption in class that we talked about, that boys of our generation automatically perceive things very sexually. And so in order to test this, what we did is we read the story of putting the devil back into hell to 2 separate groups. One was made up of 2 girls who were 21, and the other was 2 males who were also 21. And so what we hypothesized was that the men would pay more attention to the sexual innuendos than the women would. And this was based on our assumption that we thought the men's favorite part would be Rustico explicitly explaining how to put the devil back into hell to Allie Beck.
So to test our hypothesis, we just decided to read the story word for word to the men and women separately in 2 separate groups. So first we read the story just completely word for word, except omitting the parts of the frame story. We read it to the men, so took about 15 minutes, whatever, and we videotaped them while we did it. And then after we did that, we asked the men questions, and then on a separate day, and with just the women in the room, we also read them the story and asked them questions and videotaped them while we did it. We didn't need a control group for our design because we were ultimately just comparing the 2 genders' reactions to the story, and so there wasn't really a possible control group for that. And while we read the entire story was because it was short, and summarizing the story would have been really difficult because of the importance of the sexual metaphors, and it would have been really hard for us to omit those or try to change those since they're so important to the story. So after we read them the stories, we asked them a series of questions. We first did the experiment with the men, so we asked the men a lot of questions, but when we asked them what their favorite part was, it wasn't what we were expecting. So we then decided to focus our experiment with the women on what their favorite part was so we could compare the 2 groups, and we filtered the questions out. So we just asked the women essentially what their favorite part was and if they understood the story. And so this is the main focus of our experiment, is how we read the story and what their favorite parts was for each group, because it was a lot different than we were expecting.
So before we actually read the story, we were sure to warn them that it was very sexually explicit, and we asked them for their consent in case they didn't want to be read something of this content. And okay, so first we read it to the men, and it was like very visibly obvious that they were extremely uncomfortable on camera, and they didn't know how to react pretty much at all. But once the sexual connotations started arising, they started smiling a lot, a little like snickers here and there. And then once Rustico actually explained how to serve God by putting the devil back into hell, the men were extremely surprised that this was the content of the story, considering it was written in the 1300s. So at the same time, they found this really awkward, but they also thought it was pretty funny. So we realized that the men smirked and smiled at most of the really obvious sexual innuendos. These were things like Rustico explaining how to put the devil back into hell, and Allie Beck explaining at the end of the story to the ladies how to do it. But they pretty much laughed the most at Allie Beck's dissatisfaction with Rustico's devil serving her hell. So although this is where they laughed the most, they told us at the end when we were questioning them that their favorite part of the story was actually the women making fun of Allie Beck for how she had served God. And so we were actually really surprised by this, because it's really one of the least sexual parts of the story, and what we had hypothesized was that the men would pay most attention to the sexual parts of the story, and this didn't happen. So we also assumed that the men would find the story really amusing because it's kind of a funny story. But after asking them questions, they were actually very disturbed by it, especially the fact that Rustico was a religiously devout man and he took complete advantage of a 13-year-old girl. So we came to the conclusion that since they were so disturbed by this, that it may have actually distracted them from the rest of the story, because at one point when we were rewatching their reaction video, we just didn't really think that they picked up fully on all the details and really understood the story, because at many points they just had stone cold faces and no reactions at all. And then another example is that at one point when we were questioning them, one of the men, Adam, calls Rustico like Rustuccio or like something that's clearly not his name in comparison to when we were questioning the women. They clearly recall the characters' names correctly. So this just kind of shows that the men did not fully grasp what was like going on in the story and were not fully paying attention. The men also looked away a lot while we were reading. They were just kind of like distracted. Yeah, like that they were just like looking off in the distance and like twiddling their thumbs or like playing with blankets. So it just really seemed that they were like not very interested in paying attention. So this really shows like a lack of attention, which we believe could have led to a lack of understanding. And so after our experiment with the men, we read the story, as I said previously, to two women of the same age to compare the two reactions. And we noticed mainly two major things about the women. The first was that they reacted throughout the entire story with like laughs, smirks, comments, even to the small details, such as Allie Beck's family burning in their house, which the men had no reaction at all to. So this led us to believe that the women paid a lot more attention throughout the story and understood it more clearly. And after we rewatched their reaction video, we noticed that they had their eyes on us the whole time. They were actually watching us while we read the story and never looked away like the men did. And they always had some sort of reaction, whether it was just like a smirk or a giggle or sometimes even a comment to every sexual innuendo, minor details, and just the comical parts of the text. The women laughed and reacted most to Allie Beck's dissatisfaction with Rustico's devil serving her hell. And we thought this was really interesting because, it was not the main part of the story, but it was also the part that the men reacted most to. And so, as Keely described earlier, we kind of focused our experiment with the women around what we found with the men. So we asked what their favorite part was of the story to compare it to the men's. And we found that it was especially surprising that one of the women, named Lucy, mentioned that her favorite part was Allie Beck explaining how to put the devil back into hell to the women, which was the exact same answer that the men had provided us with. And then the other woman, Brenna, also liked this part, but she pointed out that her favorite part was the metaphor of throwing a bean to a lion to refer to Allie Beck's sexual flamboyancy. Finally, both groups thought it was really funny that the twist of the story is that Allie Beck actually enjoys having sex, even though in the very beginning of the story she was completely taken advantage of.
So after the story, neither group really asked us any questions. It was more of us asking them questions, which I guess you could say that's because both of them thought they understood it, but we do think, again, that the men didn't fully understand it because they were so concerned about how disturbing the context of the story was. So the first thing essentially that we asked both groups was whether they did understand the story. They both did say that they understood it, and then we followed with a bunch of following questions from there. And then, so one of the things that we noticed was, considering we read a very sexually explicit story, we learned, like, while reading these aloud is very awkward for both us as the storytellers and them as the audience. And so you don't really know how to react to something like that, but it was also awkward to just say it aloud. So, for instance, it was hard for us not to laugh when Rustico is explaining putting the devil back into hell. And it's also difficult not to hint at the funny parts that were coming up because we know what was going to happen in the story. So right before Rustico is saying that, or Alibek asks, what's that sticking out in front of you? It was really hard not for us not to laugh and elicit a response from our audience. And then also, since we warned both groups that the story was sexually explicit, when we had a reaction while reading, like we would chuckle or something while we were reading, they knew that something funny was going to come up. So that might have also, I guess, like, taken away the impact of their reaction. And then, so we did not expect to react while reading it because we already knew it was going to happen. But since it was so uncomfortable for both parties, it definitely elicited a response. And then another thing we noticed is that since we videotaped the reactions of the groups, we could have skewed their reactions because at the beginning of the recordings, all four participants were extremely awkward, and especially the men. The men, pretty much the whole thing, they were looking away. They were trying not to pay attention to the camera, but it was just, I think it was very distracting for them. And so that could have changed their reactions. Maybe if we didn't videotape them, they would have had a more genuine reaction to the story. And then, so if we did this again, we would probably practice reading the story more clearly, and so we wouldn't react to the text while reading it, so it wouldn't affect our participants' reactions. And then we did like the audience that we read it to because we were just comparing, especially our generation, based on James's comments, because we wanted to see, like, if the boys really did pay a lot more attention to the sexual parts of the story. And it was kind of funny because the women probably noticed more of the sexual parts of the story. Like, they both reacted to the most obvious, but the women definitely noticed all of them and the men didn't. And then, so for a future direction, we could change the group to something like an older versus a younger group. But, like, our parents are professors, this would probably be just too much. It would be interesting, but it would be extremely uncomfortable for both parties, so we'd probably have to use a different medium, like having them read the story themselves and then telling us what their reaction was instead of us reading it, because that would be extremely awkward.
So lastly, like, we did base our experiment off of James and the class's discussion about men in our generation being more in tune to sexual stuff. So when we were asking our questions to the men that we did our story for, we asked them if they thought that the 10 characters, 7 women and 3 men were on this trip, if they would be having sex. And they said no in this time period, but then we asked them if we were to switch until present day, if, again, 7 women and 3 men were to go on a trip together, if they would be having sex after a couple days, 7 days, I think we said. And they then said yes. So this just kind of shows that even though they didn't really pick up upon they picked up upon them, but they didn't pick them out as their favorite parts, as the sex in the story. They actually focus on it being disturbing. They still think that if they were to go on this trip, or not specifically them, or if people were to go on these trips today, then they would be having sex.
Yeah.
So.
They also, we asked them if they thought that essentially men of our generation are more sexual, and they said yes, and they said that they think, essentially, that they think with their genitals a lot of the time. So I guess even though our hypothesis was proven wrong because the men, their favorite part of the story was not the extreme sexual parts, and it wasn't what we expected, and they didn't have as explicit of a reaction as we were expecting, they still do think that men are more sexual than the women of our generation, which is definitely a very interesting point that we could elaborate on in the future. So to wrap up, we read the story to both groups. We asked we videotaped it so we could watch their reactions, and we rewatched the videos. The women paid more attention, made more eye contact. They watched us the whole time, and they picked up on just about every detail that you would think is amusing, or every sexual detail. They noticed all of them. The women's favorite part was the same as the men's favorite part. They liked the part where Allie Beck's explaining how to put the devil back into hell to the ladies. They both thought that was really interesting. And then the women also liked the part where how Allie Beck just loves sex after her experiences with Rustico and throwing the bean to the lion. And then the men, while their favorite part was also Allie Beck explaining it to the ladies, they paid less attention to us while we were telling the stories. They felt awkward. They looked away from the camera, and all of things like that. And they also think that they paid less attention because they were so disturbed by everything. They were definitely disturbed by someone of like a religious position taking advantage of a young woman. And so we think that they changed their responses because they didn't react to everything. And that was very surprising to us, because if men are more sexual, then you would think that they would think the story is more amusing and they just thought there'd be more of a reaction. And we learned that storytelling is
it's interesting.
It's interesting, but it's very awkward to say something sexually explicit in a story. Even it's just very awkward for us to do that. And so in the future, if we had to read this story again, we'd probably have to change how we did it, because we definitely probably changed responses by giving our own reaction while we were reading it. So, yeah.
Okay, we'll attach our other videos so you can watch them. They're not extremely pertinent, but they're very interesting, and they might make you laugh. So, yeah.
All right.